Subscribe now and press the bell icon so you never miss an emotional story that touches your heart. The morning sun painted golden streaks across the massive stone walls of Buckingham Palace as James Morrison adjusted his bearskin hat. For what felt like the 1,000th time, he had been serving as a royal guard for nearly 8 years now, and the weight of tradition sat as heavily on his shoulders as the ceremonial uniform he wore. At 42 years old, James was one of the senior guards, respected by his peers and trusted by his superiors. His days followed a rhythm as precise as the changing of the guard ceremony itself, each movement rehearsed, each expression carefully neutral. But something had been troubling James for the past few weeks. Small things at first. Objects moved in corridors where no one should have been walking. Faint sounds in empty rooms during his night patrols. The kind of details most people would dismiss. But James had learned long ago that in a place like Buckingham Palace, details mattered. Every corridor, every room, every corner had its place in history. And nothing happened without reason. The palace security team had recently installed a new network of hidden cameras throughout the building. It was a massive upgrade to the existing system, with state-of-the-art technology that could capture even the smallest movements in complete darkness. The official reason was enhanced security. But James wondered if someone else had noticed the strange occurrences he had been observing. He had mentioned his concerns to his supervisor, Captain Williams, who had listened carefully but suggested James might be working too many night shifts. On this particular morning, James stood at his post near the east wing, his eyes fixed forward in the traditional guardsman stance. Tourists gathered around him, taking photographs and trying to make him smile or react. He remained perfectly still, his mind wandering to the conversation he had overheard yesterday. 2 security technicians had been talking in hushed tones about footage from one of the new cameras. They had stopped speaking the moment they noticed James approaching. The day passed with its usual ceremony. The changing of the guard occurred precisely at 11 o'clock, formed with the mechanical precision that had made the ritual famous worldwide. James marched with his fellow guards, their boots striking the ground in perfect unison, their faces expressionless beneath their iconic bearskin hats. Thousands of tourists watched and recorded, capturing a tradition that had been performed for centuries. After his shift ended, James made his way through the staff corridors toward the security office. He had been summoned by Captain Williams, which was unusual. Typically, their communication happened during shift briefings or routine check-ins. A private meeting suggested something more serious. As he walked through the palace's interior passages, James passed by portraits of monarchs who had lived and died within these walls. The building held so much history, so many secrets, that sometimes he felt like a small part of something much larger than himself. Captain Williams was waiting in his office, his face unreadable. He was a stern man in his 50s, with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. He had served in the military before joining the Palace Guard, and he ran his team with military discipline. But there was something different about his expression today. Something that looked almost like concern. James entered and stood at attention. The captain gestured for him to sit, which immediately put James on edge. Sitting meant a serious conversation. Williams turned his computer monitor so James could see it and pressed play on a video file. The timestamp showed it was from 3 nights ago. Recorded at 2:17 in the morning, the footage showed one of the palace's restricted corridors, a passage that led to the oldest part of the building where historical artifacts were stored. The image quality was remarkably clear, despite the darkness, thanks to the infrared technology. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then a figure appeared at the edge of the frame. It moved slowly, carefully, as if trying not to make any sound. James leaned forward, his heart beginning to pound. The figure was small, much smaller than an adult. It appeared to be a child, perhaps 10 or 11 years old, wearing what looked like an oversized coat or jacket. The child moved along the wall, stopping occasionally to look around nervously. The infrared camera captured every detail of the small face, the wide eyes scanning the corridor with obvious fear. But what shocked James most was what happened next. The child approached a door that James knew was always kept locked. It was the entrance to the document archive, a room containing historical papers and letters dating back centuries. Without hesitation, without even trying to pick the lock or force it open, the child simply pushed the door and it swung open. The child disappeared inside. And the video continued for several more minutes, showing an empty corridor before the footage ended. Captain Williams stopped the video and looked at James with an expression that mixed confusion with something deeper. James realized his hands were gripping the armrests of his chair so tightly his knuckles had turned white. A child inside Buckingham Palace at 2 in the morning, accessing restricted areas, passing through locked doors. It was impossible. The palace security was among the best in the world. Every entrance was monitored, every visitor logged, every area controlled. The captain spoke quietly, his voice carrying the weight of the situation. He explained that this was not the first time this child had been captured on camera. Over the past 2 weeks, footage from various cameras throughout the palace had recorded the same small figure moving through corridors, entering rooms, and then vanishing. Sometimes the child appeared in areas that had only one entrance and exit, yet no camera ever captured how the child entered or left. It was as if the young visitor simply materialized and then disappeared. Security teams had conducted searches during the times indicated by the timestamps, but they had found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no hiding places disturbed, no trace that anyone had been there at all. The doors that appeared to open on camera remained firmly locked when guards checked them. It was becoming a mystery that defied logical explanation, and it was making everyone in the security team deeply uncomfortable. Captain Williams revealed why he had called James specifically. The security team had noticed something in the footage that connected all the sightings. Each time the child appeared, James had been on duty somewhere in the palace. Not always nearby, but always on the premises during those night shifts. The correlation was too consistent to be coincidence. And now the captain needed to know if James had seen anything, heard anything, or knew anything that might explain what was happening. James sat in stunned silence, his mind racing through every night shift he had worked in the past few weeks. He thought about the strange sounds, the moved objects, the feeling of being watched that he had dismissed as paranoia from too many long nights. Now those small details took on a completely different meaning. He told Captain Williams everything he had noticed, every tiny anomaly that had seemed insignificant at the time. The captain listened carefully, making notes on his computer. When James finished, Williams revealed something else that made the situation even more complicated. The child in the footage wore clothing that security experts had examined closely. The style of the coat, the type of shoes, even the way the garments were made, all suggested they were not modern. They looked like clothing from decades ago, possibly from the early 1900s. This detail had prompted the security team to consult with the palace historians, who had been reviewing old records and photographs. What the historians discovered was disturbing and fascinating in equal measure. They had found photographs from 1912 showing palace staff and their families during a Christmas celebration. Among the many faces in those old, faded pictures was a child who bore a striking resemblance to the figure in the camera footage. The historians explained that during certain periods in the palace's history, staff members had been allowed to bring their families to live in certain sections of the building. This practice had ended decades ago. But the records showed that children had once played in those same corridors where the mysterious figure now appeared. James felt a chill run down his spine despite the warmth of the office. He was not a man who believed in ghosts or supernatural phenomena. His life had been built on discipline, order, and logic. Yet the evidence before him challenged everything he thought he knew. Captain Williams seemed to sense his discomfort and suggested they review more footage together. Perhaps there were details James might notice that the security team had missed. Over the next 3 hours, James and the captain watched dozens of video clips. Each one showed the same child moving through different parts of the palace. In some footage, the child appeared to be searching for something, opening doors and looking into rooms. In other clips, the small figure simply stood still, staring at walls or windows as if seeing something the cameras could not capture. The most unnerving footage showed the child in the Grand Hall, standing beneath a massive portrait of King George V, tears streaming down the small face. James noticed something that no one else had mentioned. In several clips, the child seemed to be following a specific path through the palace. The route was not random, but appeared purposeful, as if the young visitor was trying to reach a particular destination. He pointed this out to Captain Williams, who pulled up a palace floor plan on his computer. Together, they traced the path the child had taken across multiple nights. The route led through corridors and rooms in a winding pattern that eventually pointed toward the North Wing. The North Wing was one of the oldest parts of Buckingham Palace, containing rooms that had been closed to the public for many years. Some sections were used for storage, while others had simply been sealed off because maintaining them was not considered necessary. James had only been in that area a handful of times during his years of service, always accompanied by senior staff and always for specific security checks. Captain Williams made a decision that surprised James. He wanted them to follow the path that the child had been taking, to see if it led somewhere significant. They would do this quietly, without alerting the entire security team, because the captain was worried about how the situation might be perceived. If word spread that Buckingham Palace was experiencing unexplained phenomena, it could create problems with staff morale and potentially lead to embarrassing media attention. James agreed, though he felt a growing sense of unease about what they might discover. They set out that evening after the palace had closed too. Visitors and most of the staff had gone home. James was not on duty, but he had volunteered to help investigate. They walked through the familiar corridors, both men silent as they followed the route they had mapped. The palace felt different at night, when the crowds were gone and the grand rooms stood empty. Their footsteps echoed off marble floors, and shadows seemed to move in ways that made James's trained eye constantly alert. As they walked, Captain Williams shared something personal that surprised James. He admitted that he too had experienced strange occurrences during his time at the palace. Doors that seemed to open by themselves, cold spots in rooms that should have been warm, and once, a distinct feeling that someone was standing right behind him when he was alone in a corridor. He had never reported these incidents because he feared being ridiculed or thought unfit for duty. Hearing this from a man as pragmatic and known-sense as the captain made James realize how deeply this mystery was affecting everyone involved. They reached the section of the palace that James recognized as leading toward the old servant quarters. These rooms had once housed the large staff needed to maintain the royal household. Most had been converted to offices or storage spaces over the years, but some remained virtually unchanged, preserved as historical examples of palace life from another era. The corridor they entered was narrow compared to the grand hallways designed for royal use. The walls were plain, the floors simple wood rather than marble. Captain Williams consulted the floor plan on his tablet, confirming they were following the path correctly. They came to a door that, according to the plans, led to a former servant's room. The captain tried the handle and found it locked, which was expected. He pulled out a master key and unlocked the door. It swung open with a creak that sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet corridor. The room beyond was small and sparse. A narrow bed frame stood against one wall. A simple wooden chair sat by a tiny window, and a chest of drawers occupied the corner. Dust covered everything, suggesting no one had been in this room for many years. James stepped inside carefully, his eyes scanning for anything unusual. At first, nothing seemed remarkable. Then he noticed something on the wall near the bed. Someone had drawn on the wallpaper. The drawings were crude, the kind a child might make, showing stick figures and simple houses. But what caught James's attention was how faded the drawings were. They were not fresh marks, but old ones, possibly decades old. The pencil marks barely visible against the aged wallpaper. He called Captain Williams over. They examined the drawings more closely using the captain's flashlight. Among the simple sketches, they found words written in a child's careful handwriting. The writing was difficult to read because of its age, but James could make out some phrases. One said simply, "I want to go home." Another read, "Where's Mother?" A third, written larger than the others, said, "Please find me." The words carried a desperate loneliness that affected both men deeply. Captain Williams photographed the wall with his phone, making sure to capture every detail. As he did this, James noticed something else. In the corner of the room, partially hidden behind the chest of drawers, There was a small gap in the floorboards. He knelt down to look closer and saw that one board was loose. With Williams's help, they carefully moved the heavy dresser aside to access the gap properly. James lifted the loose board and found a small space beneath it. Inside the hidden space beneath the floorboards, James found a small tin box, its surface covered in rust and age. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted it out and placed it on the dusty floor. Captain Williams crouched beside him, both men, aware they might be holding something that had been hidden for decades. The box was not locked, but the lid had corroded slightly, making it difficult to open. James worked it carefully until finally it gave way with a protesting squeak. The contents of the box told a story more heartbreaking than either man could have imagined. Inside were personal treasures of a child from another era. A small photograph showed a young girl, perhaps 10 years old, standing beside a woman who was clearly her mother. Both wore simple clothing that matched the time period the historians had mentioned. The girl's face was the same one they had seen in the security footage. There was no doubt about it. The resemblance was exact, from the shape of her eyes to the way her hair fell around her face. Beneath the photograph, they found a few pieces of jewelry. A small silver locket on a delicate chain, a simple ring that looked handmade, and a brooch in the shape of a bird. There were also letters, several of them, written in a careful adult hand on yellowed paper that crumbled slightly at the edges when James touched them. He unfolded one letter carefully, afraid it might fall apart, and began to read by the light of Captain Williams's flashlight. The letter was dated December 1911 and was addressed to a girl named Emily. It was from her mother, explaining that Emily needed to be brave and strong during their separation. The mother wrote that she had fallen ill and needed to stay at a hospital outside London for treatment. She promised Emily that as soon as she was well, they would be reunited. The letter ended with expressions of love and encouragement, telling Emily to be good for the palace staff who were caring for her while her mother recovered. James found another letter dated 3 months later. This one's tone was more desperate. The mother wrote that her illness was taking longer to heal than expected, but she was fighting hard to get better so she could return to Emily. She asked Emily to be patient and to remember all the happy times they had shared. She promised that spring would bring new beginnings, and they would be together again to see the flowers bloom in the palace gardens. The third letter was different. It was not from the mother, but from a hospital administrator, dated June 1912. The formal language could not hide the tragic news it contained. It informed the palace household staff that Emily's mother had passed away after a long illness. The letter stated that arrangements had been made for Emily to be sent to an orphanage, as no other family members could be located. The writer expressed condolences and thanked the palace for their temporary care of the child. James felt his throat tighten as he read the words. He looked at Captain Williams and saw his own emotions reflected in the older man's face. They were both fathers, both men, who understood the bond between parent and child. The thought of this young girl losing her mother, being sent away from the only home she knew, was profoundly moving. But the story did not end there. At the bottom of the box, James found one more document. It was a newspaper clipping, also from 1912, reporting on a tragic accident. A carriage transporting orphans to their new home had overturned on a country road during a storm. Several children had been injured, and one, a girl named Emily Morrison, had died from her injuries. The article was brief, just a few sentences, treating the death of a servant's child as a minor news item unworthy of much attention. But to James, seeing his own last name in connection with this tragedy made it deeply personal. Morrison was not an uncommon surname. James had no way of knowing if he was related to this child from over a century ago. Yet the coincidence felt significant, as if fate had chosen him specifically to uncover this forgotten story. He carefully gathered all the items from the box and stood up, his mind trying to process everything they had discovered. Emily Morrison had lived in this room, had waited here for a mother who would never return, and had died before ever finding peace or a new home. Captain Williams broke the silence, his voice subdued. He suggested they take everything to his office and decide how to proceed. They needed to inform the palace historians and possibly other authorities about their discovery. But more than that, both men felt a responsibility to Emily's memory. Her story had been lost to time, forgotten by history, and now they had a chance to honor her properly as they prepared to leave the room. Something extraordinary happened. The temperature in the small space suddenly dropped, becoming noticeably cold despite the warm summer evening. Both men felt it at the same time, their breath becoming visible in the air. The window, which had been closed, began to rattle gently, though there was no wind outside. James and Captain Williams stood frozen, watching as the dust in the room began to swirl in small patterns as if disturbed by movement they could not see. Then, as quickly as it had started, everything stopped. The temperature returned to normal, the window fell silent, and the dust settled. But something had changed in the room. Both men felt it, a sense that they were no longer alone, that something or someone was present with them. James thought about all the footage they had watched, all those images of Emily moving through the palace corridors. She had been searching, he realized. Searching for the mother who never came back, searching for answers about what had happened to her life. They left the room carefully, Captain Williams, locking the door behind them. As they walked back through the corridors toward his office, neither man spoke about what they had just experienced. Some things were beyond words, beyond rational explanation. They had both served long enough to trust their instincts, and their instincts told them. They had just witnessed something that connected the present to the past in ways they were only beginning to understand. Back in the office, they spread the contents of the box on the captain's desk and photographed everything. They handled each item with care, aware of its age and fragility. The photograph of Emily and her mother particularly affected James. The image captured a moment of happiness. A mother and daughter together, unaware of the tragedy that would soon separate them forever. Emily's smile in the picture was genuine, showing a child who felt loved and secure. How different her life became after that moment was captured. Captain Williams contacted the palace's head historian. He explained they had made a significant discovery and needed her expertise. Dr. Chen arrived 30 minutes later, her curiosity evident as she entered the office. When she saw the items spread across the desk, her professional demeanor gave way to visible emotion. She recognized the historical value immediately, but also seemed to understand the human tragedy represented by these artifacts. Dr. Chen examined each item carefully, confirming that everything dated from the early 1900s. She explained that palace records from that era were sometimes incomplete, especially regarding household staff and their families. The practice of allowing servants to bring children to live at the palace had been controversial even then, and detailed records were not always kept. Emily Morrison's story had likely been lost in the gaps of historical documentation, her short life reduced to a few administrative notes that no one had reason to look for until now. The historian shared something that made the situation even more poignant. She revealed that the room they had found was in a section of the palace that had once been designated specifically for children of household staff. It had served as a kind of nursery area where the children could stay while their parents worked. The room James and Captain Williams had investigated would have been Emily's personal space during the months she lived at Buckingham Palace after her mother entered the hospital. Dr. Chen spent the next hour researching through digital archives of palace records on her laptop. The three of them sat in Captain Williams's office. The late hour forgotten as they searched for more information about Emily Morrison and her mother. Finally, the historian found something. A staff register from 1910 listed a Mrs. Catherine Morrison as a seamstress in the palace's wardrobe department. The record noted that she was a widow with one daughter and had been granted permission to bring the child to live at the palace due to having no other family support. The entry explained so much. Catherine Morrison must have been skilled at her work to receive such an accommodation. As allowing servants to bring children was not common practice, she had worked at Buckingham Palace for nearly 2 years before falling ill. The records showed she had been respected by her supervisors and had received good marks for her careful work on royal garments. Her illness had struck suddenly, with the records indicating she had been moved to a tuberculosis sanatorium in early 1912. James learned that tuberculosis was a common and often fatal disease during that time period, claiming thousands of lives each year. Treatment options were limited, and recovery was uncertain. Catherine Morrison had fought for 6 months. all while separated from her daughter before finally succumbing to the disease. Emily had been left alone in the world at just 10 years old, with no family to claim her and no place to call home except the palace. Where her mother had worked, Dr. Chen found the administrative records that matched the letter they had discovered. After Catherine's death, palace officials had arranged for Emily to be sent to St. Mary's orphanage in the countryside outside London. The journey had been scheduled for July 1912. According to the records, Emily had left Buckingham Palace on a rainy morning along with a few personal belongings. That would have been her last day in the place that had been her home. The newspaper clipping they had found told the rest of the story. The carriage accident happened just 2 days after Emily left the palace. The storm had been severe, making the roads dangerous. When the carriage overturned, Emily had suffered fatal injuries. She was buried in a common grave at the orphanage's cemetery, with no family present to mourn her passing. Her entire existence had been reduced to a few lines in a newspaper and some administrative notes that no one had looked at for over 100 years. James felt an overwhelming sadness as the full picture of Emily's life came together. She had lost her father at some point before coming to the palace. Then she lost her mother to disease. Finally, she lost her own life before ever having a chance to grow up, find happiness, or create a family of her own. The security footage they had been watching suddenly made terrible sense. Emily was still here, still searching through the palace corridors. For the mother who had promised to come back but never could. Dr. Chen closed her laptop and looked at both men with an expression that mixed professional interest with genuine emotion. She acknowledged that what they were suggesting was extraordinary. The idea that Emily's spirit might somehow be present in the palace was not something that fit within her scholarly framework. Yet she could not deny the evidence before them. The security footage showed something that should not exist. And the connection to this tragic historical story was too precise to dismiss as coincidence. Captain Williams raised a practical question that had been bothering him. If Emily's presence was real, why had she only started appearing on camera recently? The new security system had been installed just weeks ago, and that was when the sightings began. Dr. Chen suggested that perhaps the new cameras, with their advanced infrared and motion detection technology, were simply able to capture something that previous equipment could not. Or perhaps something about the installation process had disturbed areas of the palace that had remained undisturbed for decades, somehow awakening or strengthening Emily's presence. James had a different thought. He reminded them that the camera footage always showed Emily following a specific path through the palace, always moving toward the north wing where her room had been. Maybe she had always been here, trapped somehow, searching for the one place where she had felt safe and loved, even in her mother's absence. The old servant's room represented the last place Emily had known as home, the last connection to her mother and the life they had shared before illness tore them apart. The three of them discussed what should be done with this information. Captain Williams worried about how the palace administration would react to a report about paranormal activity. Dr. Chen pointed out that Buckingham Palace, like many historical buildings, had its share of ghost stories and legends. This would simply be another chapter in that folklore, though one with actual documented evidence to support it. James felt strongly that they needed to do something meaningful for Emily, some gesture that acknowledged her story and honored her memory. Dr. Chen suggested they could arrange for a small memorial. The items they had found could be properly archived and displayed, telling Emily's story to future generations. The historian could write a detailed account of Emily's life for the palace records, ensuring she would no longer be forgotten by history. It was a fitting tribute, but James felt it was not enough. Emily had been appearing on the security cameras for a reason. She was trying to communicate something, searching for something, and he believed they needed to understand what that was. They decided to review the camera footage again, this time with their new understanding of who Emily was and what had happened to her. They watched the clips in chronological order, starting with the first sighting and moving forward through the weeks. Dr. Chen pointed out details they had missed before. In one clip, Emily stood for a long time in front of a portrait of Queen Mary, who would have been the reigning queen consort during Emily's lifetime. In another, she appeared in the chapel, sitting alone in one of the pews as if attending a service. The most revealing footage came from just 2 nights ago. After James and Captain Williams had found the hidden box, the camera in the corridor outside the old servant's room had captured Emily's figure appearing near the door. But this time, something was different. She was not trying to enter the room or searching through the corridors. She was simply standing there, perfectly still, facing toward where the camera was located. Her small face was visible in the infrared image, and her expression was peaceful in a way it had not been in any previous footage. Then, Emily had done something that made all 3 people watching the video catch their breath. She had raised her hand and appeared to wave, a simple gesture of farewell or acknowledgement. The image had remained for a few more seconds before fading away gradually, not disappearing suddenly as in previous footage, but slowly becoming transparent until she was gone. The camera had recorded nothing unusual in that corridor for the rest of the night. Or since that moment, James realized what this meant. Emily had known they found her belongings. Somehow, she had been aware of their presence in her room, had understood that her story was no longer hidden and forgotten. The wave had been her way of saying goodbye, or perhaps thank you, for finally bringing her existence back into the light after so many years of being overlooked by history. The thought gave James chills. It also brought a strange sense of peace. Dr. Chen agreed to begin work immediately on documenting Emily's story properly. She would research further, trying to find any additional records about Catherine and Emily Morrison. She wanted to locate Emily's grave and ensure it was marked properly with a headstone bearing her full name and dates. The historian also planned to include Emily's story in the palace's historical records, and possibly in future publications about life at Buckingham Palace during the early 20th century. Over the following weeks, James found himself deeply involved in honoring Emily's memory. What had started as a mysterious security concern had transformed into something much more personal and meaningful. Dr. Chen kept him updated on her research progress, sharing new discoveries about the Morrison family. She had found records showing that Catherine Morrison's husband, Emily's father, had died in a workplace accident when Emily was just 3 years old. Catherine had worked various jobs to support herself and her daughter before securing the position at Buckingham Palace. The historian also located Emily's burial site at the old orphanage cemetery. The grave was unmarked, just a small plot in a field that held dozens of children who had died in the care of St. Mary's Orphanage during the early 1900s. Dr. Chen worked with palace administrators to arrange for a proper headstone to be placed. The marker would read, Emily Morrison, 1902 to 1912, daughter of Catherine Morrison, beloved child. It was simple but dignified, ensuring that anyone who visited the cemetery would know that Emily had been loved and was now remembered. James took personal time to attend the dedication ceremony for the headstone. It was a small gathering, just Dr. Chen, a representative from the palace, a local minister, and James himself. Rain fell softly as they stood around the new marker, a gentle summer shower that seemed appropriate for the solemn occasion. The minister spoke about children taken too soon and the importance of remembering those forgotten by time. James placed flowers on the grave, simple daisies that he thought a 10-year-old girl might have liked, as he stood there. James thought about his own children, both grown now but still very much alive and part of his life. He imagined what Catherine Morrison must have felt, knowing she was dying and leaving her daughter alone in the world. The desperation in those letters they had found suddenly felt even more real. A mother's love transcending death itself, trying to reach across the void to comfort a frightened child. The thought brought tears to his eyes, which mixed with the rain on his face. Back at Buckingham Palace, preparations were underway for a small exhibition that Dr. Chen was organizing. The items from Emily's tin box would be displayed in a case in one of the palace's historical rooms, along with information about Catherine and Emily's story. The exhibition would explain how palace servants lived during the early 20th century and the challenges they faced. Emily's story would serve as a personal illustration of the human experiences behind the grand history of royal life. The security footage that had started, everything was not included in the exhibition for obvious reasons. Captain Williams had decided to keep those recordings confidential, filed away in a secure digital archive. However, He had shown the footage to select members of the palace administration, explaining how the investigation had led to the discovery of Emily's story. The officials had been skeptical at first, but could not dispute the evidence or dismiss the remarkable coincidences involved. James returned to his regular duties as a royal guard, but he found himself thinking often about Emily. During his shifts, especially night patrols through the older sections of the palace, he felt differently about his surroundings. The building was not just a magnificent historical structure, but a place where real people had lived, worked, loved, and suffered. Every corridor had witnessed countless human dramas, and Emily's was just one among thousands that had played out within these walls. One evening, about 6 weeks after finding the tin box, James was assigned to patrol the north wing. It was past midnight, and the palace was quiet. His footsteps echoed through the empty corridors as he conducted his routine security check. When he reached the hallway where Emily's room was located, he paused. The door was closed, as it always was now. But James felt compelled to stop and stand there for a moment. He spoke quietly into the silence, feeling slightly foolish, but also certain it was the right thing to do. He told Emily that people knew her story now. He explained about the headstone and the exhibition. He said that she and her mother would not be forgotten again, that their lives mattered and had meaning beyond the few administrative notes that had once been their only record. He finished by saying he hoped she had found peace and been reunited with her mother. Wherever spirits go when their time on earth is done, the corridor remained silent and still. No dramatic signs appeared, no temperature changes or moving shadows. But James felt a sense of closure wash over him, a certainty that his words had somehow reached their intended recipient. He completed his patrol and returned to his station, feeling lighter in spirit than he had in weeks. The mystery that had troubled him was resolved, not with logical explanations, but with understanding and compassion. Dr. Chen's exhibition opened to palace staff and select visitors the following month. James attended with his wife Sarah, whom he had finally told the whole story. She had listened with growing amazement, asking questions about details he had initially thought too strange to share. Sarah was a nurse and had dealt with death often in her work. She told James that she believed some spirits remained when they had unfinished business or when their passing had been too sudden and traumatic for them to fully understand what had happened. The exhibition was tastefully arranged in a small room off one of the main tourist corridors. Glass cases displayed Catherine Morrison's sewing tools, which Dr. Chen had located in the palace's stored historical items. Emily's photograph with her mother held a prominent place, enlarged, so visitors could see their faces clearly. The letters were displayed in protective cases, with transcriptions provided so people could read the heartbreaking words without risking damage to the fragile originals. The small tin box sat empty in its own case, a tangible connection to a child's attempt to preserve what mattered most to her. Information panels told the Morrison family's story in clear, compassionate language. Dr. Chen had written the text personally, ensuring that Catherine and Emily were portrayed as real people with hopes, fears, and dreams, not just historical footnotes. Visitors paused to read the letters, many visibly moved by the tragedy that had unfolded over a century ago. James watched people interact with the exhibition, seeing how Emily's story affected them. Parents held their children closer. Some visitors wiped tears from their eyes. Others stood in quiet contemplation, perhaps thinking about their own families and how fragile life could be. The exhibition achieved exactly what James had hoped for. Emily was no longer invisible, no longer forgotten. Her brief life had meaning and was being honored by people who would carry her story with them when they left. Sarah squeezed James's hand as they looked at the photograph of Emily and Catherine together. His wife understood without him saying anything that this case had affected him deeply. James had always taken his duties seriously, but this experience had changed his perspective on what it meant to serve at Buckingham Palace. He was not just protecting a building or maintaining traditions. He was a guardian of history itself, including the stories of ordinary people whose lives had been lived in the shadow of royalty. As they prepared to leave the exhibition, James noticed a young girl, perhaps 9 or 10 years old, standing in front of Emily's photograph. She was studying the image intently, her face serious and thoughtful. The girl's mother stood nearby, reading one of the information panels. James approached them gently and asked the young girl what she thought about the exhibition. She looked up at him with bright, intelligent eyes and said that Emily looked kind and that she wished they could have been friends. The simple, innocent statement struck James powerfully. That was exactly what Emily had been, a kind child who deserved friendship, happiness, and a long life. Instead, she had known loss, loneliness, and an early death. But now, over a century later, a living child was looking at her photograph and seeing her as a potential friend, as someone real and worthy of connection. In that moment, James understood that Emily's spirit, whether literal or metaphorical, would continue to touch people who learned her story. The weeks turned into months, and the exhibition remained popular with visitors, Dr. Chen told James that she received emails and letters from people who had seen it, thanking the palace for sharing such a human story. Some visitors shared their own family histories of loss and hardship. Others expressed appreciation for remembering the servants and working people whose labor had made the grandeur of places like Buckingham Palace possible. The exhibition had sparked conversations about class, childhood, and how history remembers different types of people. James continued his service as a royal guard, but he began volunteering his time to help Dr. Chen with other historical research projects. He discovered he enjoyed uncovering forgotten stories and giving voice to people whose lives had been overlooked. The historian appreciated his help, especially his attention to detail and his ability to notice things that others might miss. Together, they began documenting the stories of other palace servants from various historical periods, creating a more complete picture of life at Buckingham Palace beyond the royal family. The security cameras never again captured any unusual footage. The corridors remained empty during night patrols. The locked doors stayed secure, and no small figure appeared searching through the darkness. Captain Williams remarked to James that perhaps Emily had simply needed someone to find her story and tell it properly. Once that had been accomplished, she had no reason to remain. The captain spoke matter-of-factly about this, having long since accepted that his carefully ordered world included phenomena that defied rational explanation. James kept Emily's photograph on his desk at home, a copy that Dr. Chen had given him. He looked at it often, especially during difficult days when the weight of his responsibilities felt heavy. The image reminded him why his work mattered. Buckingham Palace was not just a tourist attraction or a symbol of monarchy. It was a place where real people had lived their lives, experienced joy and sorrow, and left traces of their existence for future generations to discover. His role as a guard meant protecting not just the physical structure, but also honoring the human history contained within its walls. 1 year after the discovery, James received an unexpected message. A woman in her 70s named Margaret Collins had contacted the palace after seeing a news article about the Morrison exhibition. She explained that she was a distant relative of Catherine Morrison, connected through Catherine's husband's family. Margaret had never known about Catherine and Emily, as that branch of the family tree had been lost to time and poor record-keeping. Learning about their story had been emotional for her, finally understanding what had happened to these forgotten relatives. Margaret visited the palace to see the exhibition, and Dr. Chen arranged for James to meet her. The elderly woman was deeply moved by everything they had done to honor Catherine and Emily's memory. She shared old family photographs and stories that added context to the Morrison family history. Margaret explained that Catherine's husband, Emily's father, had been a skilled carpenter who died when scaffolding collapsed at a construction site. The family had struggled financially after his death, making Catherine's position at the palace particularly important for their survival. Hearing these additional details made Emily even more real to James. She was not just a mystery captured on security cameras, but a child with a specific family history. With ancestors and relatives, with a place in the ongoing story of human existence, Margaret thanked James repeatedly for caring enough to investigate and honor her relatives. She said that knowing Emily and Catherine were remembered and respected brought her family a sense of closure they had not known they needed. Before Margaret left, she gave James a gift. It was a small wooden box that had belonged to Catherine Morrison, passed down through the family without anyone knowing its original owner. Inside were a few additional letters and a lock of baby hair, presumably Emily's, saved by her mother. Margaret wanted these items to be included in the exhibition, completing the collection of Morrison family artifacts. James accepted the gift with gratitude, promising that Catherine and Emily's story would continue to be told and honored. The meeting with Margaret Collins affected James in ways he had not anticipated. Knowing that Emily's story had brought closure and connection to a living descendant gave the entire experience a sense of completion that went beyond simply solving a mystery. He began thinking more deeply about legacy and memory, about how the things people do in life echo forward through time in unexpected ways. Emily had lived only 10 years, but her story was now touching people over a century later. Creating meaning and understanding across generations, James decided to write his own account of that investigation and discovery. Captain Williams supported the idea, though they agreed to keep certain details, particularly about the security footage, confidential. James worked on the narrative during his off hours, trying to capture not just the facts, but also the emotions and realizations that had come with uncovering Emily's story. He wanted readers to understand that history was not just dates and events, but human experiences that deserved to be remembered and honored. Dr. Chen reviewed his writing and suggested it could be published in a historical journal that focused on social history and the lives of ordinary people. James had never imagined himself as a writer, but he found the process satisfying. Putting the experience into words helped him process everything he had learned and felt. The act of writing became a form of memorial in itself, another way of ensuring that Emily Morrison would not fade back into obscurity. The article was published 6 months later. Titled Hidden Lives, Recovering the Story of a Palace Servant's Child, received positive responses from historians and general readers alike. Several people wrote to James, sharing similar stories from their own research or family histories. He learned that countless children, like Emily, had lived and died in obscurity throughout history. Their stories lost because they were not considered important enough to record. His article inspired others to search for and document these forgotten lives. Meanwhile, the exhibition at Buckingham Palace had become a permanent fixture rather than a temporary display. Palace administrators recognized its value in showing visitors a different perspective on the building's history. School groups particularly benefited from learning about Emily's story. Teachers used it to discuss Victorian society, childhood and history, disease and medical care in the past, and the importance of social history alongside political and royal history. Emily was helping educate children over a century after her own education had been cut. Short James began receiving invitations to speak about the discovery at historical societies and community groups. He was uncomfortable with public speaking at first, but Sarah encouraged him to accept. She reminded him that sharing Emily's story was important work, extending its reach beyond those who could visit the palace in person. James gradually became more confident as a speaker, learning to convey the emotional journey alongside the factual details of the investigation. During one speaking engagement at a local school, a teacher asked James what he thought Emily would want people to learn from her story. He paused, considering the question carefully before answering. He said he believed Emily would want people to remember that every life matters, regardless of social status or how long that life lasts. She would want children to know they are valued and that adults have a responsibility to protect and care for young people. Most importantly, she would want people to cherish their families and tell them they are loved. Because time is unpredictable and moments of connection are precious, the students listened attentively, some asking thoughtful questions about Emily's life and what the palace was like in her time. One girl asked if James thought Emily was happy now. He answered honestly that he did not know what happens after death, but he hoped that Emily had found peace and been reunited with her mother. He added that by remembering her and honoring her story, they were all helping to ensure that her brief life had meaning that extended far beyond her own time on Earth. As another year passed, James approached his 50th birthday and began thinking about retirement. He had served as a royal guard for a decade, and while he still took pride in the work, he felt drawn toward different pursuits. His experience with Emily's story had awakened an interest in historical research and preservation that he wanted to explore more fully. Dr. Chen had suggested he might enjoy working with the palace archives once he retired from active guard duty. helping to catalog and research the vast collections of documents and artifacts that had accumulated over centuries. The idea appealed to James greatly. He could continue serving Buckingham Palace, but in a different capacity, one that aligned with his growing passion for uncovering its forgotten stories and honoring the people who had lived and worked in the building throughout its history. He discussed the possibility with Sarah, who supported his plans enthusiastically. She had watched him transform over the past 2 years, becoming more engaged and purposeful in ways that his guard duties alone had never quite achieved. James submitted his application for the archives position and was accepted based on his demonstrated dedication to historical research and his careful attention to detail. He would begin the new role after a transition period, during which he would train his replacement and gradually shift his focus from security work to archival research. Captain Williams congratulated him, saying that James had found his true calling and that the palace would benefit greatly from his continued service in this new capacity. During his final weeks as an active royal guard, James made a point of visiting Emily's old room one last time. The space remained locked and undisturbed, preserved now as part of the palace's historical record. He stood in the corridor outside, thought about everything that had happened since that first confusing security footage appeared. What had seemed like a problem to be solved had become something far more profound, a journey into the past that had changed his understanding of his work and his place in the ongoing story of Buckingham Palace. He spoke quietly, as he had done once before, telling Emily about the changes coming in his life. He mentioned Margaret Collins and how Emily's story had reconnected lost branches of her family tree. He talked about the students who had learned from her experience and the historians who were now more aware of the importance of documenting servants' lives. He thanked her in a way for leading him to discover a purpose he had not known he was seeking. The corridor remained silent, but James felt satisfied that his words carried meaning regardless of whether anyone or anything heard them. The day came for James's final shift as a royal guard. He dressed in his uniform for the last time. The familiar weight of the bearskin hat settled on his head and took his position for the changing of the guard ceremony. Tourists gathered, as always, cameras ready, watching the precision and pageantry that had become synonymous with Buckingham Palace. James performed his duties perfectly, marching with his fellow guards in exact formation, his movements precise and dignified. But this time, as he stood at attention, James was aware of the layers of history surrounding him. He thought about all the guards who had stood in this same place over the centuries, performing this same ceremony. He thought about the servants who had worked behind the scenes, making the grandeur possible through their labor. He thought about the children like Emily who had played in the corridors and rooms now filled with tourists and officials. All of them were part of the palace's true history, the human story beneath the official narratives of kings and queens. After the ceremony concluded, James removed his uniform for the last time and changed into civilian clothes. He walked through the palace corridors as himself now, no longer on duty, but not quite ready to leave. He stopped by Captain Williams's office to say goodbye. The captain shook his hand firmly and said that James had served with distinction and had contributed something truly valuable beyond his security duties. The Emily Morrison case, Williams said, had reminded everyone involved that their work was about more than just protecting a building. It was about honoring all the lives that had touched this place. James made his way to the exhibition room where Emily's story was displayed. A few visitors were present, reading the information panels and looking at the artifacts. He stood quietly, watching them engage with the materials he had helped bring to light. One elderly man stood before Catherine Morrison's letters for a long time, his expression thoughtful. A young couple discussed the tragic story in hushed tones, clearly moved by what they were learning. This was Emily's legacy now, her ability to touch hearts and teach lessons across the vast distance of time. As James prepared to leave Buckingham Palace as an active guard, Dr. Chen appeared beside him. She had come to congratulate him on his last day and to welcome him to his new role in the archives. She handed him a folder containing research projects he could begin working on during his transition period. Several involved documenting the lives of other palace servants from different historical periods. Dr. Chen smiled, and said she looked forward to working with him on uncovering more forgotten stories. They walked together through the palace corridors toward the main exit. Dr. Chen mentioned that she had recently received another letter from Margaret Collins, Emily's distant relative, had been doing her own family research and had discovered additional Morrison family members who were interested in learning about Catherine and Emily. The family was planning a small memorial service at Emily's grave on the anniversary of her death, and they had invited James to attend. He accepted immediately, honored to be included in this family moment. That evening at home, James sat with Sarah and their 2 adult children, who had come for dinner to celebrate his last day as a royal guard. He told them the complete story of Emily Morrison, including details he had not shared before about the security footage and the strange occurrences during the investigation. His children listened with fascination, asking questions about what he thought had really been captured on those cameras. James admitted he did not have definitive answers, but he believed that somehow Emily's presence had persisted, perhaps trapped by the tragedy of her death and her longing for her mother, his daughter. A teacher said she wanted to bring her students to see the exhibition. She believed Emily's story could help young people understand history in a more personal way than textbooks typically allowed. His son, who worked in technology, was intrigued by the technical aspects of the security system and how it had captured images that should not have been possible. The family discussion continued late into the evening, with Sarah adding her own observations about how the experience had changed James and given him new purpose. In the weeks that followed, James settled into his new role in the palace archives. The work was different from his guard duties, requiring mental focus rather than physical precision, but he found it deeply satisfying. He spent his days examining old documents, photographs, and records, piecing together the stories of people who had lived and worked at Buckingham Palace over the centuries. Each discovery felt like giving a voice to someone who had been silent for too long. Dr. Chen proved to be an excellent mentor, teaching James the methods and techniques of historical research while encouraging his intuitive approach to understanding the human stories behind the facts. Together, they uncovered numerous accounts of servants, tradespeople, and workers who had contributed to the palace's functioning. Some stories were happy, showing long careers and family traditions of service. Others were tragic, revealing the harsh realities of working-class life in previous eras. Each story added depth and richness to the palace's history. The anniversary of Emily's death arrived, and James traveled to the old orphanage cemetery for the memorial service organized by the Morrison family descendants. About 20 people attended, most of them distant relatives who had only recently learned of their connection to Catherine and Emily. Margaret Collins led the service, reading from Catherine's letters and speaking about the importance of remembering family members, especially those whose stories had been lost or forgotten. James was asked to speak about the discovery and investigation. He kept his remarks brief, focusing on what he had learned from Emily's story rather than the supernatural elements that had led to the discovery. He talked about how every person's life has value, regardless of how long they live or what social position they hold. He mentioned the thousands of people who had been moved by learning about Emily and her mother, and how their tragedy had created awareness and empathy across generations. He concluded by saying that Emily's brief life had achieved a kind of immortality through memory and story, which was perhaps the closest any human could come to transcending death. After the service, several family members approached James to thank him personally. They expressed gratitude that someone had cared enough to investigate and honor their relative's memory. One woman, a great-great-niece of Catherine Morrison, gave James a framed photograph of Catherine that had been preserved in her family's collection. It showed Catherine, as a young woman, before tragedy had marked her life, smiling confidently at the camera. James accepted the gift with deep appreciation, promising to ensure it was added to the palace exhibition. Months turned into years, and James's work in the archives continued to uncover important stories. He developed a particular expertise in researching the lives of palace servants and their families, becoming a recognized authority on this aspect of Buckingham Palace history. He published several more articles and co-authored a book with Dr. Chen about the social history of royal households, Emily Morrison's story formed a central chapter. Introduced as the case that had inspired James's transition from security work to historical research. The book received positive reviews and was adopted by several universities for courses on social history and historical methodology. James found himself occasionally guest lecturing at these institutions, sharing not just the facts of his research but also the ethical dimensions of historical work. He emphasized the responsibility researchers have to treat their subjects with dignity and to remember that historical figures were real people with emotions, relationships, and experiences that deserved respect. Throughout all of this, James maintained his connection to Emily's story. He visited her grave regularly, keeping it clean and decorated with fresh flowers. He updated the exhibition at Buckingham Palace as new information emerged. He stayed in contact with Margaret Collins and other Morrison family descendants, sharing research findings and family history discoveries. Emily had become an ongoing presence in his life, not as a ghost, but as an inspiration and reminder of why his work mattered. On the 10th anniversary of discovering Emily's tin box, the palace organized a special commemoration. The exhibition was expanded with additional materials that James and Dr. Chen had uncovered over the years. A documentary film crew recorded interviews with James, Captain Williams, Dr. Chen, and members of the Morrison family, creating a permanent record of how Emily's story had been recovered and what it meant to everyone involved. The documentary would be shown to palace visitors and made available to schools and libraries. During the commemoration event, James stood before a large gathering of historians, palace staff, Morrison family members, and members of the public who had been touched by Emily's story. He reflected on how a simple security investigation had led to something so much larger and more meaningful. He talked about the importance of curiosity, of following small clues, even when they do not seem to lead anywhere obvious. He emphasized that history is not just about famous people and major events, but about all the ordinary individuals whose lives, taken together, create the full picture of human experience. As James concluded his remarks, he looked at the expanded exhibition and felt a profound sense of satisfaction. Emily Morrison had been forgotten by history, her life reduced to a few administrative notes that no one had reason to examine. But through circumstances that could be called coincidence or fate or something in between, her story had been recovered. Now she was remembered, honored, and continuing to teach people important lessons about compassion, loss, family, and the value of every human life. James Morrison had started as a royal guard whose job was to stand still and maintain tradition. He had become a historian, researcher, and storyteller whose work gave voice to the forgotten. The hidden cameras that captured Emily's image had revealed far more than a security mystery. They had opened a window into the past and created a bridge between generations, allowing a child who died over a century ago to touch the hearts of people living in a completely different world. That, James believed, was the true magic of history and the real power of remembering.